My mother hired a locksmith to break into my house and claim it as hers. They forced the door open, expecting victory, but what waited inside stopped them cold, turning confidence into pure, silent fear. So I smiled and said, "Welcome home, Mom. Enjoy your new residence in handcuffs." This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. I was sitting on the cold tile of my bathroom floor, clutching a washcloth against my forehead, when the first notification popped up on my phone. The flu had taken me down hard 3 days earlier. Fever, chills, aching joints, the kind of illness that makes you feel like your own body has turned against you. I had barely been able to stand long enough to make a cup of tea, let alone keep up with the constant pinging of my home security system. But that night, the sound cut through the fog of my fever like a blade. My security app was alerting me. Motion detected at the front door. I dragged myself upright, my muscles screaming in protest, and squinted at the screen. The camera feed showed 2 figures standing on my front porch. One was a man in a work uniform, carrying a toolbox. The other, my blood ran cold despite the fever burning through me, was my mother, Brenda. She stood with her arms crossed, her chin lifted in that familiar expression of smug authority, pointing at my front door and giving the man instructions. I watched, trembling not from the illness but from something far worse, as the man knelt down and began working on my lock. My mother had hired a locksmith to break into my house. The betrayal was worse than the fever itself. I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing through 1,000 thoughts at once. My mother. My own mother. Standing on my porch at 9 o'clock at night, paying a man to break into the home I had spent 5 years saving for, 3 years renovating, and countless sleepless nights protecting. The home that was mine, legally, morally, and in every way that mattered. My hands shook as I scrolled through the security feed. The cameras I had installed, top-of-the-line equipment, the same systems I recommended to clients every day as a home security consultant, captured everything in pristine detail. The locksmith's face, my mother's gestures, the exact moment the lock clicked open and she reached for the handle with a triumphant grin. But my mother had forgotten one crucial thing. I wasn't just any homeowner. I wasn't just any daughter. I was the woman who had spent her entire career learning how to anticipate threats, how to outmaneuver intruders, and how to protect what was hers. And I had been preparing for this moment far longer than she realized. I set the phone down on the bathroom counter and took a long, slow breath. The fever still raged through my body, but a new kind of heat was building in my chest, a fire that had nothing to do with illness and everything to do with the woman who had given me life and was now trying to steal it from me. My phone buzzed again, a text from my mother. "Sweetheart, don't worry about the house. I'll take good care of it. You always were too sick to manage something this big anyway. Get some rest. Mom." I read the message 3 times. Each time, the words settled deeper into my bones like ice. She wasn't just breaking in. She was announcing it. She was telling me to my face that she was taking my home and expected me to accept it. She had always operated this way, bold, brazen, convinced that her authority as my mother gave her the right to control whatever she wanted. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. I picked up my phone, opened a second app, one that controlled a very different set of systems inside my house, and I began to prepare. To understand why my mother felt entitled to my home, you have to understand the history between us. Brenda had always seen my accomplishments not as mine, but as extensions of herself. When I graduated at the top of my class in criminal justice, she told everyone it was because she had pushed me to succeed. When I landed my first job at a security firm, she called it the family's achievement. And when I bought this house, a beautiful 3-bedroom colonial on a quiet street with a sprawling backyard, she said the words that should have warned me. That house should have been mine. I found it first, you know. I drove past it years ago and told your father we should buy it. In a way, it's always been mine. I had laughed it off at the time. That was my mistake. For 30+ years, I had given my mother everything. I had paid her bills when my father left and she had no income. I had covered her medical expenses, her car payments, even the property taxes on her own small condo when she fell behind. I had done it without complaint, without keeping score, because that was what daughters did. That was what I believed a loving child was supposed to do. And then there was Marcus. My younger brother, the golden child who could do no wrong in Brenda's eyes. Marcus was 38, unemployed more often than not, and living rent-free in our mother's condo. He never contributed $1 to her expenses. He never attended a single doctor's appointment. But he was the one she called her pride and joy, while I was the one she called when she needed something. The real antagonist in this story, though, the one who orchestrated everything, was Brenda herself. At 65, my mother had perfected the art of manipulation into something almost elegant in its cruelty. She had the appearance of a woman who had never worked a day in her life. Perfectly coiffed silver hair, manicured nails, designer handbags she bought with money I had given her for necessities. She had taken to calling herself a real estate enthusiast in recent years, a title she bestowed upon herself after attending a handful of weekend seminars at a local community center. She had no license, no credentials, and no real knowledge. But she had ambition, the kind of ambition that comes from a bottomless sense of entitlement, and she had her eyes fixed firmly on my home. It had started subtly months ago. She would visit and comment on the hardwood floors, running her fingers along the grain and saying, "These are worth a fortune, you know." She would stand in my kitchen, admiring the granite countertops, and murmur, "This is exactly the kitchen I've always deserved." She would walk through my backyard, arms outstretched, and whisper, "Can't you just see me sitting out here every morning with my coffee?" Then the questions started, questions about the deed, questions about my will. Questions about whether I had properly documented my ownership, whether I had any contingencies in place in case something happened to me. She asked them with a smile, always with a smile, the same smile she used when she was about to ask for money. And now, standing on my porch at 9 o'clock at night with a hired locksmith, that smile was the last thing I saw before she pushed my front door open and stepped inside. But she had forgotten one crucial thing. I knew she was coming. I had known for weeks, and the house she was walking into was not the empty, vulnerable target she expected. It was a trap, carefully designed, meticulously set, and waiting for her with open arms. The truth was, I had been preparing for this moment for months. Not because I wanted to believe my own mother would stoop so low, but because I knew her. I had spent 42 years studying Brenda the way a sailor studies the sea, learning the patterns, the swells, the sudden storms that appeared from nowhere. And every instinct I had, every professional and personal alarm bell in my body, had been screaming for weeks that she was planning something. It had started with the locksmith inquiries. 3 weeks ago, a colleague of mine, Dan, who ran a locksmith business downtown, had called me out of the blue. "Evelyn, did you lose your keys or something? Because a woman named Brenda called my shop asking about getting a lock changed at your address. Said she was your mother and you'd authorized it." My blood had run cold then, too. I told Dan to decline the job, thanked him, and sat in silence for a long time afterward. Then I started making calls. I reached out to 3 other locksmiths in the area, gave them my address and my mother's name, and asked them to flag any requests. 2 of them confirmed that a woman matching Brenda's description had already called, claiming she was the homeowner's elderly mother who had been locked out by her ungrateful daughter and needed emergency entry. That night, I installed additional cameras. Not just outside, inside. The living room, the hallway, the kitchen. Every angle covered, every feed recording to a cloud-based server that my mother knew nothing about. I also installed a secondary smart lock on the interior of the front door, one that could be engaged remotely, trapping anyone who entered until I chose to release it. Then, I called Officer Davis. Officer Rachel Davis was a 15-year veteran of our local police department and someone I had worked with on numerous security consultations over the years. We had a professional relationship built on mutual respect, and when I called her and explained the situation, she listened without interruption. "Evelyn, are you telling me your mother is planning to break into your house?" she had asked, her voice measured but concerned. "I'm telling you, she's already tried to hire 4 locksmiths. It's only a matter of time before she finds one who doesn't ask questions. And when she does, I want it on record that I did not authorize entry. I want it documented that she has no legal right to be in my home." Officer Davis agreed to file a preliminary report. She also agreed, after I explained my plan in detail, to be on standby the night it happened, because we both knew it was not a matter of if. It was a matter of when. I also called my attorney, Patricia Holloway. Patricia had handled my home purchase and had seen firsthand the way Brenda had tried to insert herself into the transaction, demanding to be added to the deed, insisting the house be placed in a family trust with her as the trustee. Patricia had gently but firmly shut down every attempt, and afterward she had pulled me aside and said, "Evelyn, your mother is going to be a problem. Mark my words." Now, sitting in my bathroom with a fever raging through my body and my mother on my security feed pushing open my front door, I activated the plan. I opened the app and engaged the interior smart lock. The front door locked behind my mother and the locksmith with a soft, decisive click that I could hear even through the camera's audio feed. Then I called Officer Davis. "She's in," I said, my voice steady despite the chills racking my body. "Phase 1 is complete. She's inside." "I'm 5 minutes out," Davis replied. "Don't engage her alone, Evelyn. Wait for me." I wasn't alone. I hadn't been alone in weeks. Because in addition to the cameras and the locks, I had also hired a private investigator named Frank Mosley. Frank was a retired detective with a reputation for thoroughness, and I had given him a simple task: investigate my mother's recent activities. What he had uncovered had confirmed every fear I ever had. Brenda had been researching adverse possession laws, those obscure legal statutes that allow someone to claim ownership of a property if they've lived in it openly and continuously for a certain number of years. She had been posting in online forums, asking questions about how to establish residency in a home that belonged to a family member. She had even consulted with a disreputable paralegal, not a lawyer, but a paralegal, who had apparently advised her that if she could get inside the house, change the locks, and establish that she was living there, she could eventually lay claim to it. Frank had documented everything: screenshots, forum posts, receipts from the paralegal's office, a paper trail that stretched back months, all of it pointing to one undeniable conclusion: my mother had been systematically planning to steal my home. And now she was standing in my living room, staring straight into a camera she hadn't noticed yet, with a locksmith at her side and a look of absolute triumph on her face. I pulled up the live feed on my phone and watched. Watched as she looked around my home, the home she had decided was hers, and nodded with satisfaction. Watched as the locksmith set down his toolbox and pulled out a new lock, clearly expecting to change it on the spot. Watched as my mother pulled a small envelope from her purse and began placing photographs of herself around my living room, on the mantel, on the side table, next to my daughter's school picture. She was staging the house, making it look like she lived there. The audacity took my breath away, but she had forgotten one crucial thing. I was watching. I was recording. And in approximately 4 minutes, Officer Davis was going to walk through that door with backup, and my mother's carefully constructed scheme was going to crumble around her like a house of cards in a hurricane. I pushed myself off the bathroom floor, steadied myself against the counter, and walked to my bedroom. I pulled a blazer from my closet, slipped it on over my pajamas, because if I was going to face my mother tonight, I was going to do it with whatever dignity I could muster, and I walked out into the hallway. From the top of the stairs, I could hear voices below. My mother's voice, sharp and commanding, directing the locksmith to make sure the deadbolt is a high-grade one because my daughter has terrible taste in security. The locksmith, a man I now recognized from the feed as Gary, was nodding along, clearly uncomfortable but equally clearly committed to the job he'd been paid to do. "Ma'am," Gary was saying, "I just need to confirm, one more time, that you have authorization to change these locks. I don't want any trouble." "My daughter is very ill," Brenda replied, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "She asked me to come over and handle this. She's been begging me to move in and take care of the house. I'm her mother. Who else would she trust? I gripped the banister so hard my knuckles turned white. The lies came so easily to her. Always had. They rolled off her tongue like honey, sweet and smooth, and designed to make anyone who questioned her feel like the unreasonable one. I reached for my phone and texted Officer Davis. She's telling the locksmith I authorized this. Move quickly. The response came immediately, pulling into your driveway now. The knock on the front door was sharp, authoritative, and unmistakable. 3 firm strikes that echoed through my house like a judge's gavel. Brenda's head snapped toward the door. On my phone screen, I watched her expression shift from triumph to confusion in the span of a single heartbeat. The locksmith, Gary, froze with his tools still in his hands, looking from the door to my mother and back again. "Who is that?" Brenda whispered, though the cameras picked up every word. "I don't know, ma'am," Gary said, already taking a step backward. "I didn't think anyone else was here." "Don't answer it," Brenda hissed. "Just keep working, it's probably nothing." But the knocking came again, louder this time, followed by a voice that carried through the wood of the door like it was made of paper. "This is Officer Davis, city name, police department. We have received a report of an unauthorized entry at this address. Please open the door immediately." I watched my mother's face on the camera feed. I watched the color drain from it. I watched her eyes go wide, her mouth open and close twice without producing a sound, and her hands, those perfectly manicured hands, begin to tremble at her sides. For the first time in my entire life, I saw my mother look genuinely afraid. Gary, to his credit, moved toward the door immediately. "I'm opening it," he called out, his voice shaking. "I'm opening it right now." He turned the handle, but the interior lock held firm. The door didn't budge. Gary looked back at Brenda, panic rising in his eyes. It's locked from the inside. There's a secondary lock I can't disengage." Brenda stared at him. "What do you mean, there's a secondary lock?" "This is my daughter's house. There shouldn't be." "Ma'am," Officer Davis's voice came through the door again, sterner now. "We know you are inside. We have been informed that the homeowner did not authorize entry. Open this door, or we will be forced to enter by other means." I stepped down the stairs. Each footfall was deliberate, measured, and firm. I could see Brenda through the open doorway of the living room, standing rigid, her purse clutched against her chest like a shield, those photographs of herself still clutched in one hand. She looked up as I descended, and our eyes met. "Evelyn," she breathed. You're here, I thought you were." Sick, I finished for her. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stood in the hallway, facing her. The fever was still there, burning behind my eyes, making my joints ache and my skin prickle. But I stood as straight as I could, and I looked my mother in the eye. "I am sick, Mom, but not too sick to protect my home." "Evelyn, sweetheart, let me explain." "You don't need to explain," I said quietly. "I've been watching you for weeks. I watched you hire this locksmith tonight. I watched him break open my door. I watched you walk into my house and start staging it with your photographs. I have every second of it on camera, Mom, every single second." The silence that followed was deafening. Gary looked like he wanted to dissolve into the floor. Brenda's mouth moved, but no words came out. Her eyes darted to the cameras, those small, unobtrusive lenses she had never noticed during all her visits, and for the first time I saw recognition flash across her face. She saw them, all of them. The living room, the hallway, the kitchen, watching, recording, documenting her every move. You set me up," she whispered. "No, Mom," I said, and my voice was calm, steady, and final. "You set yourself up. I just made sure the world could see it." I walked past her, unlocked the interior smart lock, and opened the front door. Officer Davis stood on the porch, another officer behind her, their faces set in the serious, no-nonsense expressions of people who had seen everything and were not impressed. "Good evening, Evelyn," Officer Davis said, glancing past me into the living room. "I see we arrived at the right time." "Officer," I said, stepping aside, "please come in." Brenda took a step forward, her hand reaching out toward me. "Evelyn, please. I'm your mother. I was worried about you. I thought you might need help." "Help?" I turned to face her, and the word came out harder than I intended. You brought a locksmith to change the locks on my house, Mom. You brought photographs of yourself to stage the living room. You told Gary that I begged you to move in. That is not help. That is a crime. Brenda's face twisted, not into fear this time, but into something harder, something I had seen before. Anger. The kind of anger that came from being cornered, from being caught, from having the narrative snatched away from her. You ungrateful child, she hissed, and her voice was low and venomous. After everything I've done for you, after every bill I paid, every sacrifice I made, this is how you repay me, calling the police on your own mother. You didn't pay any bills, Mom, I said, and my voice cracked for the first time that night. Not from weakness, but from the sheer weight of 42 years of truth finally pressing against my chest. I paid your bills, I paid your medical expenses, I paid your car, I paid your property taxes, and you stand in my home, the home I bought with my own money, the home you never contributed a single dollar to, and you call me ungrateful. Officer Davis stepped forward, positioning herself between us. Ma'am, she said to Brenda, I need you to step away from the door and have a seat. We're going to sort this out, but I need you to cooperate. Brenda's eyes blazed. This is my daughter's house, and I have every right to be here. This is my house, I said, pulling a folder from the hall table drawer where I had placed it weeks ago, waiting for this exact moment. I handed it to Officer Davis. The deed, the mortgage documents, the security camera footage, which has been recording to a cloud server since 9:14 this evening, and a copy of the police report I filed 3 weeks ago when I first learned my mother was trying to hire locksmiths to break in. Officer Davis opened the folder, scanned the first page, and looked up at Brenda with an expression that was all business. Ma'am, I'm going to need to ask you some questions. Brenda opened her mouth, probably to lie, probably to spin some elaborate story about how this was all a misunderstanding, probably to cry and play the victim the way she always did. But before she could speak, Gary the locksmith stepped forward, his hands raised. Officer, he said, his voice trembling, I need to tell you something. This woman, she told me her daughter was sick and had asked her to come change the locks. She said she had authorization. She paid me $500 in cash. I have the receipt right here. He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. I didn't know this was, I never would have. If I'd known this was unauthorized, I never would have. Gary, I said gently, no one is blaming you. You were deceived, but your testimony matters. Gary nodded, his face pale and drawn, and turned to Officer Davis. I'll give you whatever you need. A statement, the receipt, whatever. I swear I thought this was legitimate. Brenda's face went from pale to scarlet. She spun toward Gary, her finger raised. You were supposed to be a professional. You said you could do this. Ma'am, Officer Davis said sharply, I need you to stop talking. Right now. The room fell silent. The only sound was the soft hum of my security cameras, recording every moment, every word, every expression on my mother's face as her plan collapsed around her. Brenda sat on my couch, the couch I had picked out, paid for, and sat on alone for 3 years, with her hands folded in her lap and her jaw set in that stubborn lock I knew all too well. Officer Davis had allowed her to sit while she reviewed the documents, but the other officer, Officer Martinez, a young man with careful eyes, stood nearby, watching her with the quiet vigilance of someone who knew that cornered people did unpredictable things. I sat in the chair across from her. The fever was still there, a dull, persistent fire beneath my skin, but the adrenaline had pushed it to the background. I would pay for this later, tomorrow probably, when the exhaustion hit and my body finally surrendered to the illness it had been fighting. But right now, I was present. I was alert. And I was not going to let my mother manipulate her way out of this. Ma'am, Officer Davis began, looking up from the folder, the documentation is clear. This property is solely in Evelyn's name. There is no joint ownership, no family trust, no legal agreement of any kind that grants you access to or authority over this residence. Do you dispute that? Brenda's lips pressed together. I don't dispute that the deed is in her name, but I. And do you acknowledge that you hired a locksmith to enter this property tonight without Evelyn's consent. Brenda's eyes flickered toward me, then back to the officer. I was concerned about my daughter. She's been very ill. I came to check on her. By changing the locks, Officer Davis asked, her tone even but pointed. I wanted to make sure the house was secure, for her protection. Mom, I said, and my voice was quiet but firm, you brought photographs of yourself. You were placing them around my living room. You told Gary that I had begged you to move in. That is not concern, that is invasion. Brenda's composure cracked just slightly. A flash of something, panic, rage, desperation, crossed her features before she smoothed them over again. Evelyn, you're exaggerating. I brought a few family photos to make the house feel warm. That's what mothers do. They make homes warm. Mothers don't hire locksmiths to break into their daughters' houses, I replied. And mothers don't research adverse possession laws online. Brenda's face went white. Yes, Mom, I said, leaning forward. I know about that too. I reached into the folder and pulled out a second set of documents, Frank Mosley's findings, the screenshots of her forum posts, the receipt from the paralegal's office, the list of locksmiths she had called, 4 in total before she found Gary. I laid them on the coffee table, one by one, like cards in a hand I had been holding for weeks. You posted on a legal advice forum under the username, Proud Mama 65, I read aloud. My daughter owns a beautiful home that she doesn't appreciate. She's always sick and can barely take care of it. Is there any way I can establish residency and claim it for myself? I've heard adverse possession might work. Any advice welcome. I looked up. That was posted 6 weeks ago, Mom. Brenda's mouth opened, but nothing came out. And this, I continued, sliding the paralegal's receipt forward. You paid a man named Victor Sando $300 for advice on how to establish legal occupancy in a property owned by a family member. He gave you a step-by-step guide. Get inside, change the locks, move personal belongings in, establish a paper trail showing you live there, wait out the statutory period. I paused. That was your plan, wasn't it? Break in, make it look like you lived here, and wait until the law said the house was yours. That man told me. Victor said it was a legitimate legal strategy. Victor Sando is not a lawyer, Mom. He's a disbarred paralegal who was sanctioned 3 years ago for giving fraudulent legal advice. He's currently under investigation by the state bar. I let that sink in for a moment before continuing. You paid a fraud to help you commit fraud, and you did it to steal my home. The room was silent. Officer Davis wrote something in her notebook. Officer Martinez shifted his weight. Gary sat in the corner, staring at the floor, looking like he wished he were anywhere else on earth. And then Brenda did what Brenda always did when she was cornered. She played the victim. This is my own daughter, she said, and her voice broke, genuinely broke, or at least performed a remarkably convincing imitation of breaking. I raised her, I fed her, I gave her life. And she treats me like a criminal. All I wanted was to be close to her, to take care of her, to have a home where I could spend my remaining years surrounded by the family I love. She was crying now. Tears rolled down her cheeks and she pressed a hand to her chest, her shoulders shaking. It was a performance I had witnessed 100 times, at family gatherings, at my father's departure, at every moment when accountability came knocking and she needed to redirect the sympathy back toward herself. But I was not the same little girl who used to fall for it. Mom, I said softly, I paid for your condo. I pay your HOA fees. I pay for your car, your insurance, your groceries. I have given you a home, a real home in your name that you get to live in every single day. And you repaid me by trying to steal mine. Brenda's tears stopped as quickly as they had started. She looked at me with eyes that were suddenly, startlingly clear. You were always selfish, Evelyn, she said, her voice low and cold, just like your father. The words landed like a slap. My father, the man who had left when I was 12, who had walked away without a backward glance, who had never called, never written, never sent a birthday card. The man my mother had spent 30 years comparing me to every time I disappointed her. The man whose name she wielded like a weapon. But this time, the weapon didn't cut. No, Mom, I said, and I was surprised by how steady my voice was. I am nothing like him. He left. I stayed. I stayed and I gave you everything I had. And you're the one who's leaving tonight, not walking away from your family, but being removed from my home by the police. There's a difference. Officer Davis stood. Brenda, based on the evidence presented, security footage, documented planning, witness testimony, and the homeowner's sworn statement, I am placing you under arrest for attempted breaking and entering, conspiracy to commit fraud, and criminal trespass. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The rest of the Miranda warning faded into the background as I watched my mother rise from my couch. She stood slowly, her chin lifted, her eyes fixed on some distant point over my shoulder, the way she always stood when she was trying to maintain dignity in a moment of utter humiliation. "You'll regret this," she said to me, her voice barely above a whisper. "You'll regret turning your back on your own mother." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time I saw her not as the towering, terrifying figure of my childhood, but as a small, desperate woman who had let greed and entitlement consume whatever love she might have once felt. And instead of anger, instead of pain, I felt something I hadn't expected. I felt peace. "No, Mom," I said quietly. "I won't." Officer Martinez guided her toward the door. As she passed me, she stopped, her eyes meeting mine one last time. There was something in them, something that might have been regret, or might have been rage, or might have been the terrible, hollow realization that she had finally lost the game she had been playing for decades. I couldn't tell. And for the first time in my life, I realized that I didn't need to. She walked out my door, and I watched her go. 3 weeks later, I stood in the community room of our local library, surrounded by 50 people who had gathered for what my brother Marcus had called a family meeting. He had organized it at my mother's request, or rather, at my mother's instruction, delivered through Marcus from the county jail where she was awaiting her court date. She had wanted a gathering of family and close friends, a platform from which she could explain her side of things, rally support, and I suspected, paint me as the ungrateful villain who had put her own mother behind bars. Marcus had called me the day before, his voice tight and uncertain. "Evelyn, Mom wants you there. She says she has things she needs to say to you, in front of everyone." I had agreed. Not because my mother asked, but because I was done hiding. I was done absorbing her blows in silence. I was done letting her control the narrative while I sat in the background, bleeding quietly. If she wanted a public stage, I would give her one. But it would be on my terms. The room was arranged with folding chairs in neat rows. Marcus sat in the front, his hands clasped between his knees, looking like a man who had not slept in days. He had always been caught between my mother and me, loyal to her by default, by conditioning, by the gravitational pull of being the child she had chosen to love most openly. But in the 3 weeks since her arrest, something had shifted in him. I had seen it in his phone calls, in the way his voice cracked when he asked me if the evidence was really as bad as the police report suggested. He was struggling. I could see it in the dark circles under his eyes, the way he kept glancing at the door as if hoping his mother would walk through it and make everything simple again. She didn't. She couldn't. She was still in custody, her bail having been denied after the judge reviewed the extent of her planning. But she had sent a letter, a long, handwritten letter that Marcus was supposed to read aloud on her behalf. He held it now, a creased envelope in his trembling hands. The room buzzed with murmurs. Aunt Caroline, my mother's sister, sat in the second row with her arms crossed, her expression thunderous. Uncle Frank, my father's brother, sat near the back, looking deeply uncomfortable. Cousins, family friends, neighbors, people who had known Brenda for decades and had been fed her version of events for weeks. I could feel their eyes on me as I walked to the front of the room. I could hear the whispers. She had her own mother arrested. I heard she set a trap for her. Brenda would never do something like that. She's a good woman. I stood behind the small podium, adjusted the microphone, and waited for the room to settle. My fever had broken days ago, but the exhaustion still clung to me like a second skin. I had lost weight, I had lost sleep, but I had not lost my resolve. "Thank you all for coming," I began. I know you're here because my mother asked you to be. I know many of you have heard her version of what happened 3 weeks ago. I'm here to give you mine. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Aunt Caroline leaned forward, her eyes narrowed. The room went quiet. 3 weeks ago, my mother hired a locksmith to break into my home, I said, keeping my voice steady and clear. She did this while I was home, sick with the flu, alone and vulnerable. She told the locksmith that I had authorized the entry, that I had begged her to move in. She brought photographs of herself to stage around my living room to make it appear as though she lived there. Her intention, documented extensively through her own online posts, her communications with a disbarred paralegal, and her repeated attempts to hire multiple locksmiths, was to establish residency in my home and eventually claim it as her own through adverse possession. The room was dead silent. I could hear the fluorescent lights humming above us. I have all of the evidence with me today, I continued, and I lifted a large binder from the floor and set it on the podium. Security camera footage, screenshots of my mother's forum posts, made under the username ProudMama65. Receipts from the paralegal she consulted. Testimony from 4 locksmiths she contacted before finding one who would do the job without asking too many questions. A copy of the police report I filed 3 weeks before the break-in, when I first learned of her plans, and a statement from the locksmith she eventually hired, confirming that she misrepresented herself and her authorization. I opened the binder and turned it toward the audience. From where I stood, I could see the first page, a full-color screenshot of my mother's forum post, her username circled in red, the date and timestamp clearly visible. A gasp rippled through the room. My mother has spent decades making me feel small, I said, and my voice wavered for the first time. Every achievement I ever had, she claimed as her own. Every dollar I earned, she treated as an entitlement. I paid her bills, her medical expenses, her car, her condo. I did it because I loved her, because I believed that was what a good daughter did. And in return, she planned to steal the one thing I had built entirely on my own, my home. I paused, letting the words settle. I looked at Marcus. He was staring at the floor, his jaw clenched, the letter from my mother still clutched in his hands. He had not opened it. He had not read it. And I realized in that moment that he was not going to. "Marcus," I said gently. He looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed, glassy, and full of a pain I recognized because I had felt it myself for years, the pain of loving someone who hurts you and not knowing how to stop. "Marcus, you have that letter," I said. "You can read it if you want. But before you do, I want you to look at what's in this binder. Not because I want to turn you against Mom, but because I need you to see the truth. I need you to see what she planned, how carefully she planned it, and how long she had been planning it. And I need you to decide, right now, in front of everyone, whether you want to be part of her plan or whether you want to stand with the sister who has never stopped loving you." The silence that followed was the longest of my life. Marcus stared at me, and I could see the war raging behind his eyes, the decades of conditioning, the golden child status that had kept him tethered to our mother's approval, the fear of losing her love battling against the undeniable evidence sitting in front of him. His hand tightened around the envelope. Then, slowly, deliberately, he set it down on the chair beside him. He stood up, he walked to the podium, and he did something he had never done in 40 years of life. He chose me. "I didn't know," Marcus said, his voice raw and cracking, addressing the room. "I swear to you, I didn't know what she was planning, but looking at this," he gestured at the binder, his hand trembling, "I can't defend this. I can't defend her, not after this." He turned to me, and his eyes were filled with tears. "Evelyn, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for every time I stood by while she treated you like you owed her everything. I'm sorry for every time I didn't speak up. I'm sorry for being too afraid to lose her love to see what she was doing to you." My own tears fell then. I reached out and took my brother's hand, and for the first time in our adult lives, we stood side by side, not as my mother's children, divided and conquered, but as two people who had finally seen each other clearly. Aunt Caroline stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is ridiculous. Brenda is not a criminal. She's a mother who tried to steal her daughter's home," Uncle Frank said quietly from the back of the room. He was standing now, his face grave and sad. "Caroline, sit down, read the evidence, then talk." Caroline opened her mouth, closed it, and sat down. She did not speak again. The room began to shift. One by one, people approached the podium, looked at the binder, and saw the truth. Some of them apologized to me. Some of them simply shook their heads and walked away. And some of them, the ones who had known my mother longest, who had seen the pattern of manipulation over the years but had never been able to name it, said the words I had waited my entire life to hear. I always wondered when someone was going to stop her. The legal proceedings moved faster than anyone expected, largely because the evidence was so comprehensive and my mother's actions so clearly premeditated that her court-appointed attorney advised her to accept a plea deal. Brenda pleaded guilty to attempted breaking and entering, conspiracy to commit fraud, and criminal trespass. The judge, a woman with silver hair and a gaze that could cut glass, sentenced her to 18 months in a county rehabilitation facility, followed by 3 years of probation. The sentence was not harsh by legal standards, but it was decisive. It was a formal legal acknowledgement that what my mother had done was not a family misunderstanding, not a mother's overstep, but a crime. The paralegal, Victor Sando, was also charged with unauthorized practice of law and fraud. His case was still pending, but the state bar had already issued a formal complaint, and Frank Mosley, the private investigator I had hired, told me that several other victims had come forward, people who had paid Sando for equally fraudulent advice. My mother's scheme had inadvertently helped expose a larger network of legal fraud, and the district attorney's office was building a case that would ensure Sando never hurt anyone else. I obtained a permanent restraining order against my mother. It was not something I did lightly or with pleasure. It was something I did because I knew, with the certainty of a woman who had spent 42 years studying the patterns, that without it, she would try again. Not the same way, perhaps. She would adapt. She would find a new angle, a new scheme, a new way to insert herself into my life and take what she believed she deserved. The restraining order was a line drawn in concrete, not sand, and I drew it not out of vengeance, but out of self-preservation. Marcus and I spent the weeks after the library meeting rebuilding our relationship. It was not easy. Years of distance and misunderstanding do not dissolve overnight, and there were moments, painful, halting conversations in which we circled around old wounds without quite touching them, that tested us both. But Marcus showed up. He came to my house, and he sat in the living room where our mother had once staged her photographs, and he listened. He listened to me describe what it had been like to grow up in Brenda's shadow. Always giving, never enough, always falling short of the impossible standard she had set. He listened to me talk about the years of financial support, the exhaustion of being both daughter and provider, the loneliness of being the child who did everything right and still was never enough. And then, for the first time, he told me his side. He told me what it had been like to be the golden child, the pressure of being the one our mother loved most openly, the terror of ever disappointing her, the way she had used his loyalty as a weapon against me. He told me that he had known on some level that she was unfair to me, but that confronting it would have meant risking the one thing that made him feel valuable, her approval. "I was a coward," he said, his voice breaking. "You were afraid," I corrected him. "There's a difference, and you're not afraid anymore." He wasn't. In the months that followed, Marcus did something I had never expected. He moved out of my mother's condo, the condo I was still paying for, and got his own apartment. He found a job, a steady one in construction management, a field he had always been good at but had never pursued because our mother had convinced him that working with his hands was beneath him. He started paying his own bills. He started showing up not just for me, but for himself. I kept the condo in my name, but transferred the management to a property service, renting it to a young family who needed an affordable home. I did not feel guilty about this. My mother had a roof over her head in the rehabilitation facility, and when she was released, she would have to figure out her own housing, just as I had figured out mine, alone, at 22, with nothing but a starting salary and a determination to build something of my own. My professional network proved invaluable in the aftermath. I connected Officer Davis with the evidence from Frank's investigation, which she used to strengthen the case against Sando and identify 2 additional victims of similar schemes: elderly people who had been targeted by the same fraudulent advice network. Patricia Holloway, my attorney, helped me navigate the restraining order and ensured that every legal safeguard was in place to protect my home and my assets from any future attempts. And Frank Mosley, the retired detective, told me with a quiet smile that my case was one of the most satisfying he had ever worked on. "You didn't just protect yourself, Evelyn," he said on our final call. "You protected the next person she would have targeted, maybe not with a house, maybe with something else, but you stopped her. That matters." The house itself became something new after that night. I replaced the front door lock, not with a secondary smart lock, but with a beautiful, heavy deadbolt that I had always wanted, one with a brass finish that caught the afternoon light. I rearranged the living room, hung new curtains, and planted a garden in the backyard: tomatoes, herbs, sunflowers, the kind of garden I had always dreamed of but never had the energy to create. The house that had been a fortress, designed to keep someone out, slowly became a home again. On a warm evening in late September, 3 months after the break-in, I sat on my back porch with a cup of tea and watched the sun set over my garden. Marcus was coming over for dinner the next day. He was bringing his new girlfriend, a kind, grounded woman named Lisa who made him laugh in a way I had never heard before. My house was quiet, peaceful, and entirely mine. Not because I had fought for it, though I had. Not because I had defended it, though I did. But because I had finally, after 42 years, understood that I deserved it. My mother had spent my entire life telling me that I was not enough, that my achievements were hers, that my home was hers, that my very self was an extension of her will. But sitting on that porch, watching the light fade behind the trees, I knew the truth. I was enough. I had always been enough. And no one, not even the woman who had given me life, had the right to take that from me. I took a sip of tea, closed my eyes, and breathed. The air smelled like earth and sunflowers and the faint, sweet promise of autumn. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, I was not afraid.